At 10:34 in the morning on February 18, 1943, the radio operator at Boeing Field in Seattle picked up a transmission that made every person in the control tower go completely still. The voice on the other end was calm, almost unnaturally calm. It belonged to a man named Eddie Allen, and he was telling them in a flat and precise tone that engine number 1 on the XB-29 was on fire, and that he was attempting to return to the field. The tower operator asked if he needed emergency vehicles. Allen said yes. Then engine number 2 caught fire. Then Allen stopped answering. The plane hit a meatpacking plant on the edge of the city at 400 feet and exploded with enough force that people felt it 12 blocks away. Eddie Allen was 42 years old. He was the best test pilot in America, not arguably, not in some people's opinion. Boeing paid him more than any other test pilot in the country because they knew what they had in him, and they knew what they were asking him to fly. He was the kind of man who did not panic, who did not rush, who did not put himself into a situation he had not already thought through 3 times. He died anyway. Along with 10 crew members and 20 workers in the building below him, the engineers who tore apart what was left of the wreckage found the answer inside the engine nacelles. The Wright R3350 was generating so much heat at high power settings that internal magnesium components were igniting. The plane was burning itself alive from the inside. And here is the part that should make your stomach drop. The United States Army Air Forces had already placed orders for over 1,000 of them. Nobody in Washington canceled the program. Not for a day, not for an hour. Because the B-29 was not really an airplane. It was the answer to a question that kept every American general awake at night. The question was this: how do you end the war against Japan without putting American soldiers on Japanese beaches? The people who had seen the classified casualty projections for a ground invasion of the Japanese home islands did not talk about the numbers in public. The lowest estimate was 500,000 American dead. Other estimates went higher, much higher, and that was before accounting for the Japanese civilian militia that the imperial government was already training with bamboo spears and instructions to kill any foreigner on sight. An invasion of Japan was not a military operation. It was a slaughter with no good ending. The B-29 was supposed to make that invasion unnecessary. It flew at 30,000 feet, far above the ceiling of any Japanese anti-aircraft gun and above the practical service ceiling of Japanese fighters. It carried 10 tons of bombs. It had a pressurized crew compartment, remote-controlled gun turrets, and enough range to strike Tokyo from bases in the Pacific. It was supposed to be untouchable. It was supposed to make Japan's factories disappear from the air while American boys stayed safe at altitude. General Henry Arnold, the commander of the Army Air Forces, had told Congress exactly this. He had staked his reputation on it. He was not going to let Eddie Allen's death change the story. He told Boeing to fix the engine problem and keep the production lines moving. Boeing said they would. They were not lying. They just did not understand yet how completely they were going to fail. 6,000 miles away from Washington, in the city of Nagoya on the main Japanese island of Honshu, a factory called the Mitsubishi Aircraft Works was running 3 shifts a day, producing 0 fighter engines. The plant manager, a 51-year-old engineer named Takashi Moriwaki, had been receiving intelligence reports about the American B-29 program since 1943. He read them with professional interest. He was not frightened. His factory was built of concrete and steel. His workers were organized and disciplined. He had spoken to the officers at the local air defense headquarters, and they had shown him their radar coverage maps and their anti-aircraft battery positions and their fighter scramble protocols. The defenses were serious. He went back to work confident that whatever the Americans were building, the Japanese military was prepared for it. By the autumn of 1944, Moriwaki had revised his opinion slightly. The B-29s flying out of China had attempted a few raids on Nagoya, and they had been poor. bombs landing in fields, bombs landing in the bay. The local newspaper called it evidence of American desperation. Moriwaki was more careful than that. He read the raid reports closely and noticed something the newspaper did not mention. The Americans were flying at 30,000 feet. His anti-aircraft batteries could not reliably reach 30,000 feet. His fighter pilots could barely reach 30,000 feet, and when they did, their planes were sluggish and slow at that altitude. But the bombs were also completely inaccurate at 30,000 feet. Moriwaki thought about this for a while and concluded that the Americans had a problem they did not know how to solve. He wrote a report to the Regional Defense Authority, suggesting they relax. The B-29s could not hurt them from 30,000 feet. He was right, and he was wrong. He put the report away and went back to work. Back in the Marianas, the B-29 crews were living the problem Moriwaki had correctly identified, and they had no solution. After the first major strike against Tokyo in November 1944, the photo analysts spread the strike photographs across their tables and went quiet. The bombs had fallen through 30,000 feet of air and drifted miles from their targets in winds so powerful, nobody on the American side had anticipated them. At 30,000 feet over Japan in winter, the atmosphere generates a river of air called the jet stream that moves west to east at speeds that can exceed 150 miles per hour. Nobody had ever conducted a strategic bombing campaign from inside it before. Nobody had thought to check whether the physics of dropping a bomb through it would cause a problem. They caused a problem. The Norden bomb sight, the most advanced precision optical instrument ever installed in a military aircraft, was designed for winds measured in tens of miles per hour, not hundreds. The bombs fell forward at enormous rates, carried by winds the sight could not account for. They hit nothing that mattered. Japan's factories kept running. The Mitsubishi Aircraft Works in Nagoya kept producing 0 engines, 3 shifts a day. And above the clouds, the B-29 crews flew mission after mission and watched their bombs disappear into gray overcast and found out later that they had hit rice fields and harbor water and empty hillsides. The toll mounted, not from enemy fire, from their own engines. The fix that Boeing had implemented for the fire problem was to reduce power during the climb. In combat, over the Pacific, carrying a full bomb load with no diversion field within reach if an engine quit, reducing power was not a solution. It was a gamble played with 11 lives at a time. The crews who went into the ocean and did not come back are in the record books as aircraft losses. The water temperature, the drift rates, the inadequacy of the search and rescue apparatus in 1944, all of that is in other reports that not many people read. The B-29 program by the end of 1944 was a documented catastrophe packaged in press releases that used words like magnificent and precision and unstoppable. General Haywood Hansell, the man commanding the operation from the Marianas, was a true believer in precision bombing doctrine. He kept sending the bombers back at 30,000 feet. He kept adjusting his formations. He kept writing measured, careful reports to Washington, explaining that the situation was difficult, but improving. Arnold read the reports and read the bomb damage assessments and read the loss tallies, and on January 6, 1945, picked up the telephone and fired him. The replacement was a man named Curtis LeMay. He arrived on Guam with a cigar already going, said almost nothing to anyone for 3 days, and started reading files. Every mission record, every weather report, every bomb damage assessment going back 18 months. The staff watched him and waited. Nobody knew what he was going to do. LeMay was not the kind of man who told people what he was thinking before he was finished thinking it. What he was thinking was that the entire foundation of the campaign was wrong. Not the planes, not the crews, not the bases, the entire idea of how to use them, and he had already figured out what to do instead. It was going to be the most dangerous order any American air commander had given in the entire war. He was already certain he was going to give it. Chapter 2. Curtis LeMay arrived in the Mariana Islands in January 1945 and said almost nothing for 3 weeks. He read the mission reports, all of them. He read the bomb damage assessments. He read the weather data going back 18 months. He read the maintenance logs for every B-29 that had gone down over the Pacific. He walked the flight line at night when everyone else was asleep and looked at the planes sitting on the hard stands, their enormous frames barely visible in the moonlight. He was not a man who gave speeches. He was not a man who called meetings to discuss feelings or morale. He was a man who looked at a problem from every angle until he found the one approach that nobody else had tried. And then he executed it with a ruthlessness that made people around him uncomfortable. What LeMay had figured out in China, and what he was now confirming by reading the Mariana Islands records, was that the precision bombing campaign was not failing because of the jet stream, or the clouds, or the engines. It was failing because the entire tactical foundation of the campaign was wrong. The doctrine said bomb from high altitude in daylight with precision. The doctrine was built around the assumption that the object was to minimize risk to the aircraft while maximizing bomb accuracy. In Japan, neither was happening. The planes were not safe from the engines catching fire. They were not accurate through the jet stream and the clouds. So the two justifications for the entire approach had both been destroyed by reality. LeMay started doing arithmetic. Japan was an island. Its cities were packed tight in coastal plains between mountains and the ocean. The buildings in those cities were made primarily of wood and paper. Japanese residential architecture was extraordinarily vulnerable to fire, far more vulnerable than the brick and concrete of European cities where American bombers had been operating. If you were not going to destroy Japanese factories with precision weapons, the alternative was to destroy the neighborhoods where the factory workers lived and the supply lines that fed the factories. And wood burns, fire spreads, a city built of wood and paper and bamboo, dense as Tokyo was dense, crammed onto a flat coastal plain swept by winter winds from the northwest, would burn in a way that no European city could burn. LeMay did not write poetic memos about this. He ran numbers. How much incendiary payload per square mile? What wind speeds were needed? What concentration of bombs was needed to start a fire that could not be extinguished by a whole city's firefighting apparatus? His team ran the calculations and showed him the answer. The answer was terrible and efficient. LeMay looked at it for a long time and did not flinch. The plan he came up with was unlike anything any Air Force commander had attempted in the war. He was going to strip the guns out of the B-29s. The remote-controlled gun turrets that had been one of the signature innovations of the aircraft, that had cost enormous time and engineering to develop, were going to be removed. The ammunition, hundreds of pounds of it, was going to be left on the ground. The gunners who operated those turrets were going to stay home. The reason was weight. Every pound of gun and ammunition removed from the plane was a pound of incendiary bombs that could go into the bomb bay instead. His officers looked at him when he explained this. They pointed out that without guns, the B-29s would be defenseless against Japanese fighters. LeMay told them to look at the weather forecast. He was going to fly the mission at night. Japanese night fighter capability in early 1945 was minimal. The radar systems were primitive. The airborne intercept equipment was unreliable. At night, without the problem of glare and visibility, Japanese fighters would be groping in the dark, looking for American planes they could not see. LeMay's second change was altitude. Instead of 30,000 feet, the planes would fly at between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. Practically on the rooftops, by bomber standards. The reason was again about the payload. At low altitude, the engines did not have to work as hard. The planes could carry more bombs, and at low altitude there was no jet stream to carry the bombs sideways. What you aimed at, more or less, was what you hit. The officers pointed out that at 5,000 feet, every flak gun in Japan could reach them. LeMay agreed. He did not say this was safe. He said it was necessary. The third change was the most unusual. LeMay was not going to bomb in formation. Formation flying was the doctrine, because it concentrated defensive fire from the gun turrets. But without gun turrets, formation flying had no benefit and enormous cost. Each plane would fly to the target independently, navigate on its own, drop its bombs, and return to base on its own. This was not how the Air Forces operated. Bomber crews trained for years to hold position in formation under fire. LeMay was telling them to forget everything and fly alone into a defended city in the dark. He scheduled the mission briefing for early March. The target was Tokyo. He wanted to destroy 16 square miles of the city in a single night. His planning officer looked at that number and told him it was not achievable. No air bombing campaign in history had destroyed that much urban area in a single raid. The German bombing of London had not done it. The British bombing of Hamburg had not done it in one night. LeMay told his planning officer to run the math again. The planning officer ran the math again, and the answer came back the same. It was inconceivable. LeMay scheduled the mission brief anyway. On March 8, 1945, the crews of the 21st Bomber Command assembled in briefing rooms on 3 islands in the Marianas. The intelligence officers uncovered the maps. The target markers were on Tokyo. The crews had been to Tokyo before. They had come back with cold reports about bombs that hit nothing and engines that caught fire, and friends who went into the ocean and did not come up. The briefing officers began explaining the plan. As they described the altitude, 5,000 to 9,000 feet, a sound went through the rooms, not a shout, something quieter than a shout. The kind of sound a room makes when 200 men all have the same thought at the same time, and none of them want to say it out loud. At that altitude, every man in the room understood the Japanese anti-aircraft guns would have a field day. The briefing officer explained that the planes would have no guns. Another silence, different from the first one. These were men who had been trained to believe the gun turrets were the reason they might survive. The briefing officer explained that each plane would fly to the target independently. No formation. The crews looked at each other. Everything they had been taught about survival told them formation was life. Because scattered planes were easy prey for fighters, and the only protection you had in a single-engine dive was the crossfire from your wingmen covering your tail. The briefing officer kept talking. He described the bomb load. M69 incendiary cluster bombs. Each cluster opened at 2,000 feet and scattered dozens of small cylinders that ignited on impact and burned at a temperature that could not be extinguished with water. He explained the target. Not a specific factory, not a specific military installation, the neighborhoods of eastern Tokyo. The Shitamachi Ward, the most densely populated urban area in Japan, packed with the small workshops and home factories that fed parts into the larger military-industrial system. He showed photographs. Wooden buildings packed together like kindling. Streets so narrow that 2 people could not walk side by side. Everything dry from the winter wind off the continent. The pilots calculated what 5,000 feet meant. They calculated what 5,000 feet above Tokyo meant when every flak battery in the city could depress its barrel and point straight at you. They calculated what it meant to fly alone in the dark, with no guns, and no wingmen, and a bomb bay full of things that lit on fire if the wrong piece of shrapnel opened a fuel line. One pilot, a 23-year-old from Ohio named James, turned to the man next to him and said quietly that this was going to be bad. The man next to him did not answer because there was nothing to say. That night the crews wrote letters. Some of them were the letters men write when they are not sure they are coming back. They did not say that in the letters. They talked about home, about food they missed, about what they were going to do when the war ended. They sealed the envelopes and left them in their barracks. Chapter 3. At 5 o'clock in the evening on March 9th, 1945, the first B-29 rolled to the end of the runway on Guam and pushed its throttles to the firewall. The right engines caught the fuel and screamed. The plane was so heavy with incendiary bombs that the pilots flying the first waves were told to get airborne and get out of the way before the next plane rolled. There was no time for the slow, careful formation climb that was the normal procedure. One after another, 334 B-29s lifted off from 3 islands into a dusk sky, climbed to their assigned altitudes, and turned northwest toward Japan. The formation that existed was not really a formation. It was a river of planes spread over 60 miles of sky, each one flying its own course, each crew alone with the sound of their engines and the dark ocean 3 miles below, and the knowledge of what waited at the end of the flight. The Pathfinder planes went in first. Their job was to mark the target. They carried the same incendiary clusters as the planes behind them, and they dropped their loads in a pattern across the eastern edge of Tokyo that created an enormous X-shaped trail of fire visible from the aircraft 2 hours behind them. When the main force arrived over the target, they would not need to find the city. They would find the fire. The Pathfinders flew their run at low altitude and broke away from the target to the south, climbing hard to get out of the smoke. The smoke was already enormous. The first fires had caught in the wooden neighborhoods and were spreading faster than anyone had predicted, even LeMay, who had run the calculations and thought he understood what would happen. The wind was blowing at 28 miles per hour from the northwest that night. LeMay had planned around a wind of about 15 miles per hour based on the forecasts. The extra wind was not in the plan. The extra wind was turning the scattered fires into something else entirely. When the main force of B-29s arrived over Tokyo 2 hours after the Pathfinders, the pilots stared at what the first aircraft had created. From 5,000 feet, the city looked like it was boiling. The fires that had started in the wooden neighborhoods had spread into a single interconnected blaze that covered multiple square miles and was generating its own weather. The heat rising from the burning city was creating thermal updrafts so violent that the B-29s were being thrown upward hundreds of feet without any control input from the pilots. The planes bucked and rolled in the unstable air as they made their bomb runs. The smell came through the air system into the pressurized compartments. The crews smelled burning wood and something else that none of them described in the immediate after-action reports, but some of them wrote about years later. The bomb bay doors opened, and the incendiary clusters fell. They opened at 2,000 feet and scattered their cylinders across the neighborhoods below in patterns calculated to overlap with the bombs falling ahead of them and behind them. The flak was exactly as deadly as the crews had feared. From 5,000 feet, the Japanese anti-aircraft guns had a clear shot. The shells burst in dark clouds around the formation, and the fragments ripped through aircraft skin and fuel lines, and sometimes through crew members who were sitting at their stations doing their jobs and had no protection against it. Planes caught fire. Not from their own engines this time. From the flak. A shell would open a fuel line, and the burning fuel would spray back across the wing, and the crew would have seconds to decide whether to stay with the plane or go out the hatch into the burning air above Tokyo at 5,000 feet with a parachute and the reasonable expectation of landing in the middle of the largest fire in Japanese history. Some of them stayed with the planes and tried to fly out. Some of them went out the hatch. The city was so hot by this point. The thermal column rising from the fires was so intense that parachutes caught in the updraft, and pilots found themselves being carried upward, away from the burning streets, into the cold air above the smoke. Some of them survived. 14 B-29s went down that night over Tokyo or in the ocean around Japan. On the ground, what was happening in Tokyo in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning on March 10th was not a bombing raid in any sense that people had previously understood the term. The fires that LeMay's incendiaries had started in the wooden neighborhoods of the Shitamachi did not burn the way European cities burned when hit by bombs. Tokyo burned the way a paper lantern burns when you hold a match to it. The wind from the northwest pushed the flames east and south at a walking pace that was faster than the terrified residents of the neighborhood could move through the crowded streets. The streets were narrow. The alleys were narrower. Families grabbed children and pushed through crowds trying to reach the rivers or the parks or any open space where the fire couldn't follow. The fire followed. The thermal energy of the burning city was enough to ignite buildings that were not yet on fire, yards ahead of the main blaze. The fire did not need to spread from building to building. It jumped. The fire department of Tokyo had been organized for decades around the assumption that a fire anywhere in the city could be contained if enough personnel responded quickly enough. Nothing in the training of Japanese firefighters had prepared them for a fire that covered 20 different city blocks simultaneously and was spreading in every direction faster than the hoses could be repositioned. The water pressure in the city mains dropped as hundreds of hoses tried to pull from the same system at the same moment. The tanks ran dry. The fire breaks that had been cut through the neighborhoods in the months before, in preparation for exactly this kind of raid, were not wide enough to stop a fire driven by a 28-mile-per-hour wind. The fire breaks stopped the flame front for perhaps 2 minutes. Then the wind carried the heat across, and the wooden building on the other side caught, and the fire was past the break and still moving. People reached the rivers and jumped in. The rivers were not safe either. The water temperature in the Sumida River rose as the city around it burned, and the people packed into the river, clinging to the banks and each other, found the water warm, and then warmer, and then too warm to survive. The smoke was the least understood killer of that night around the world at the time. The carbon monoxide from the burning city spread through the streets in concentrations that were immediately lethal. People who did not reach the rivers, who huddled in alleys trying to wait out the fire, died without any burns at all. By 4 a.m, when the last B-29 turned south away from the target and the crews looked back at what they had left behind, the fire was still burning. The smoke column was visible from the returning aircraft at 60 miles. The smell was still in the cockpits. LeMay was awake at his headquarters on Guam when the first planes began landing. He stood at the edge of the runway and had a cigarette and watched his aircraft come in. Some of them were shot up. One landed with its hydraulic system gone and went off the end of the runway and collapsed its gear without killing anyone. The maintenance crews walked out to the returning aircraft with flashlights and looked at the flak damage before the planes had finished cooling. They counted the holes. LeMay walked back to the operations center and waited for the crew debriefs. The intelligence officers were already taking statements from the Pathfinder crews. The numbers coming off the debriefs were almost too large to report. Photography was not possible until the following morning, when reconnaissance aircraft finally flew over Tokyo, but the fire was still burning when they arrived. The photographs the reconnaissance planes brought back showed a blacked wasteland 16.8 square miles in extent in the eastern sections of the city. The area previously covered by one of the most densely inhabited urban districts in the world was gone. The operations center was quiet when the photo analysts walked in. LeMay looked at the reconnaissance photographs for a very long time without speaking. The plan had said 16 square miles. The plan had been called inconceivable by his planning officer 6 days earlier. The photographs showed 16.8. LeMay put the photographs down and began planning the next mission. Because Tokyo was not the only city in Japan built of wood, and there were not enough nights left in the war to do this slowly.